My name is Major Katie Ward, 35 years old, an officer in the United States Army. Throughout my career, I've faced enemy fire, but no bullet ever felt as piercing or as painful as my father's words that night. In the middle of a high-end Boston steakhouse, he leaned back, let out a dry laugh loud enough to make the next table turn, and said, his voice hissing through his teeth, "Nobody here actually likes you, Katie. You're an embarrassment in that uniform." My sister Jessica just smirked, a cruel little twist of her lips, while my mother, she just silently bowed her head, cutting into her filet mignon with the kind of focus you'd give to the most important task in the world. They thought my silence was defeat. They had no idea that in my head, a combat order had just been issued. Before I tell you about the first move in my operation, and why a week later my father was screaming into my voicemail calling me a grateful traitor, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe family should be your safe harbor, not your first battlefield. The silence in my apartment near Fort Belvoir, Virginia, was a comfort I'd come to rely on. It was a clean, orderly silence, the kind that follows a successfully completed mission. My last video conference call, a tense briefing that had stretched into the late afternoon, was finally over. I stood in my kitchen, the disciplined lines of the countertops clear and uncluttered, and poured myself a tall glass of iced tea. The clinking of the ice cubes against the glass was the only sound as I walked to the window, looking out over a landscape of manicured suburban peace that always felt a world away from the dust and chaos I knew overseas. This was my debriefing room, my personal sanctuary. That's when my phone rang, shattering the quiet. The caller ID read, "Mom." I took a breath, a conscious effort to lower my defenses, to let a little bit of hope in. "Hi, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Katie, honey, I have the most wonderful news." Her voice was high and bright, a little too bright, like a light bulb flickering under too much voltage. "Jessica's getting married. Can you believe it? My little girl." For a split second, a genuine warmth spread through my chest. A wedding. That's what families did. They came together for weddings. Maybe this was it. The event that would finally bridge the gap that had widened into a canyon between us over the years. Jessica and I hadn't always been at odds. I could vaguely remember a time when we whispered secrets under the covers, when she was just my big sister, not my polished, perfect rival. "Wow, Mom, that's great news," I managed, the flicker of hope growing a little stronger. "When's the big day?" "This spring. It's all happening so fast, you know how Jessica is. We'll get an invitation out to you soon, of course." She said it so casually, as if my attendance was a simple logistical detail, like booking the caterer. Still, I allowed myself to hope. I allowed myself to imagine standing beside my sister, dressed in a soft, flowing bridesmaid dress, a world away from my crisp dress blues. I allowed myself to feel for just a moment like a daughter and a sister, not just an officer. A few days later, the invitation arrived. It was exactly what I'd expected from Jessica. Thick, cream-colored cardstock with elegant, swirling calligraphy. It felt heavy in my hands, substantial, official. But when I slid the inner card from the envelope, the weight in my hands turned to a block of ice in my stomach. My breath hitched. It was addressed to Major Katie Ward. But the address itself for my unit had the zip code wrong. A small detail, but it screamed of a carelessness so profound it felt intentional. Then I read the enclosed card. It wasn't a request to be her maid of honor, a role I'd foolishly, childishly, always assumed would be mine. It was a list of assignments. My name was listed next to 2 duties: gift table management and guest parking coordination. Below, in my sister's perfect, looping handwriting, was a small note scrawled in blue ink. "You're used to telling people what to do, right? Figured you'd be a huge help." The air left my lungs in a painful rush. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a mistake made in the chaos of wedding planning. This was a message, calculated and delivered with surgical precision. I wasn't family. I was personnel. I was a resource to be deployed. The uniform they resented was now being repurposed to direct their friends' luxury sedans into parking spots. The insult was so absolute, so breathtakingly cruel, that for a long moment I could do nothing but stare at the card, the beautiful, hateful words blurring in front of my eyes. My first call was to my mother. I needed to hear her say it was a misunderstanding, a stupid joke, anything. She answered on the third ring, her voice already laced with a familiar weariness. I explained what the invitation said, my own voice tight and controlled, a soldier reporting enemy contact. There was a long, heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Oh, Katie," she said, and her tone was filled not with shock or anger on my behalf, but with a tired, familiar blame. "Don't make a big deal out of this. Jessica is just so stressed. She just thought you could lend a hand. You know, with your personality. You're not exactly a bridesmaid dress kind of person, are you?" Her weak excuse, the implicit judgment of who I was, hurt more than Jessica's open contempt. She wasn't defending me, she was managing me. She was blaming me for having the audacity to be wounded. In her world, my pain was an inconvenience to Jessica's perfect wedding narrative. The silence that followed her words was a confirmation of everything I feared. She was a passive accomplice. She saw the wound, and instead of helping, she told me to stop bleeding on the carpet. I ended the call without another word. The hurt, white hot and sharp just moments before, began to cool, crystallizing into something hard and clear. Resolve. I was done. Done begging for scraps of affection from their table. Done accepting the bit parts they assigned me in the story of their perfect family. I would not be defined by their small-minded roles. No, I would do something bigger. I would make one last, grand gesture. I would invite them to a lavish dinner, give them a gift so extravagant they couldn't refuse it, and force them, for once, to see me. Not the uniform, not the convenient problem solver, but me. "I will make them listen," I said to the empty, silent room. But as I began to plan, a cold question echoed in the back of my mind. Why did I think this time would be any different? What made this insult the final straw, after a lifetime of smaller, sharper cuts? Before I tell you what happened at that dinner in Boston, you need to understand the battles I'd already lost, long before I ever put on a uniform. The wedding invitation wasn't a singular act of cruelty. It was the culmination of a lifetime of them. It was another pin pushed into a map of my life that was already crowded with painful landmarks. To understand the cold resolve that settled in my heart that day, you have to understand the terrain of my past, the geography of my family's particular brand of indifference. The first major landmark was erected when I was 16. I remember the smell of gunpowder clinging to my clothes and the satisfying weight of the state marksmanship trophy in my arms. It was a gleaming, gold-plated cup on a marble base, and my heart pounded with a bright, clean pride I'd never felt before. I had worked for this. Every weekend, every afternoon I could spare, I was at the range, practicing my breathing, my focus, my stance. I had earned this. That night at dinner, I carefully placed the trophy in the center of the dining table where it caught the light. I waited. Finally, my father glanced at it, a brief, dismissive flick of his eyes. Then he turned his full attention to my sister, a senior that year. "So, Jessica," he said, leaning forward with a sudden, vibrant interest that was a punch to my gut, "tell me about the speech for your student council president campaign." And just like that, I vanished. The rest of the meal became the Jessica show. They dissected her campaign strategy, her opponent's weaknesses, the teachers she had successfully charmed. The trophy sat between the salt and pepper shakers like a foreign object, an unwanted guest. At one point, Jessica caught my eye and smirked. "Who are you planning on shooting with that thing, Katie?" she asked. My father chuckled. The pride I'd felt just an hour earlier curdled into a familiar, hot shame. After dinner, I quietly carried the heavy trophy up to my room. I didn't put it on my bookshelf or my dresser. I slid it under my bed into the dusty darkness, hiding a piece of myself right along with it. It felt less like a victory and more like evidence of a crime, the crime of being different. A few years later, another landmark. My first Thanksgiving home from West Point. I was a plebe, raw and exhausted, but filled with a fierce sense of accomplishment. I had survived Beast Barracks. I was part of something built on honor and sacrifice. I wore my dress gray uniform to the family gathering. the high collar stiff against my neck, a tangible symbol of everything I had endured. I was proud. We were all gathered around the enormous table, the scent of roast turkey and sage stuffing hanging in the air. One of my uncles, a kind man, turned to me. "So, Katie, what's it really like at the academy? Must be tough." I opened my mouth to share the stories of camaraderie, the grueling marches, the weight of history you feel walking across the plain. But before I could form a sentence, my father cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Oh, come on, let's not talk about that dreary business," he said with a forced laugh that set my teeth on edge. "Jessica, tell everyone about your internship on Wall Street. This kid's making more money as an intern than some generals do." The table erupted in appreciative laughter. Jessica, preening under the spotlight, launched into a story about a high-stakes deal, dropping names and figures that made everyone's eyes widen. I sat there, frozen. The laughter wasn't cruel. It was worse, unthinking, absolute dismissal. In that moment, my uniform, my symbol of honor, felt like a ridiculous Halloween costume. It represented a world so foreign and uninteresting to them that it was better left undiscussed. I spent the rest of the dinner silently pushing mashed potatoes around my plate, feeling the crushing loneliness that only a crowded room of your own family can create. But the most painful memory, the one that truly defined the rift, came after my first tour in Afghanistan. I came home with a new limp from a shrapnel wound and a Bronze Star medal with a V for valor. I'd earned it pulling 2 of my men out of the line of fire during an ambush. I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt lucky to be alive. But the medal, it meant something. It was validation from the only family that had ever truly seen me, the Army. I showed it to my father one evening. He was in the living room, flipping through a glossy real estate magazine. He took the medal from its velvet box and turned it over in his hands. He held a piece of my soul, a testament to the worst and best day of my life, and he examined it like he was inspecting a piece of fruit at the grocery store. "Well, that's nice," he said, his voice flat, utterly devoid of emotion. "But can it buy you a house in this neighborhood? Jessica just closed on a gorgeous place over in Windsor Farms." He placed the medal down on the coffee table. It made a small, dry, metallic sound as it touched the wood, landing right next to the magazine cover advertising multi-million-dollar properties. He didn't just dismiss my courage, he assigned it a monetary value and found it wanting. He laid down my sacrifice and placed a price tag on it. And it wasn't enough. But amidst those bleak, gray memories, there was one point of light. My grandfather, William, a World War II vet. A quiet, stoic man who smelled of Old Spice and saw things other people missed. He was the one who first took me to a shooting range. He didn't fill the air with chatter. He just stood behind me, his hand gently correcting my stance, his voice a low rumble. I remember the first time I hit a bullseye. I looked back at him, expecting loud praise. He didn't offer any. He just nodded slowly, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "See?" he said, his voice full of quiet satisfaction. "You've got it." Steadiness. That one word, steadiness, became my anchor. It was the only validation I ever needed, and the only one I ever truly got from my blood relatives. He saw my difference not as a flaw, but as a strength. If you've ever had that one person in your life who saw the real you when no one else did, please hit the like button and in the comments, just type the word steadiness, so I know I'm not alone. As I stood in my apartment years later, the cruel wedding invitation still in my hand, I walked to my dresser and opened a small wooden box. Inside, resting on blue velvet, was the Bronze Star. I picked it up, its weight familiar in my palm. My grandfather had seen my steadiness. My father had seen a trinket. Tonight, in Boston, I decided I would give them something they couldn't put a price on, something they couldn't ignore. I would give them a piece of my world, a piece of my honor, and they would be forced to finally, truly, see me. I chose the Capitol Grill in Boston for a reason. It was my father's language. The dark mahogany walls, the hushed clinking of heavy silverware, the scent of aged beef and expensive Cabernet. It was a cathedral dedicated to the god he worshipped. Success. I thought, foolishly, that if I met them on their turf, spoke their language, they might finally listen. I arrived early, my heart hammering against my ribs with a nervous rhythm that felt foreign in my own body. I smoothed down my simple black dress for the 10th time, a useless gesture to calm the storm inside me. I was a major in the U.S. Army. I had led troops under fire. But sitting here, waiting for my family, I felt like a raw recruit on her first day. They arrived in a wave of expensive perfume and casual entitlement. Jessica's eyes scanned the opulent dining room with a practiced, judgmental gaze, while my father gave a curt nod of approval, as if he were inspecting a property. The tension was immediate, a physical presence at the table, sitting right beside me. We made it through the small talk, the brittle questions about my job, and the glowing reports of Jessica's fiancé's latest business triumph. We ordered our food. Filet mignon for them, of course, the most expensive cuts. Then, the moment came. My hands felt slick as I reached into my purse and pulled out 3 thick, cream-colored envelopes. I placed them on the starched white tablecloth. "I wanted to give you all a gift," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "For the wedding, and just because." My mother looked hesitant, but Jessica snatched hers up immediately. She tore it open with an impatient flick of her wrist, her eyes scanning the contents. Inside were first-class plane tickets to France and a detailed itinerary for a private, guided tour of the Normandy American Cemetery and the D-Day landing beaches. I held my breath. "I wanted to share a part of my world with you," I explained softly. "A place that means a lot to people like me." Jessica looked up from the itinerary, and a slow, cruel smirk spread across her perfectly lipsticked mouth. "Normandy? Seriously, Katie?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Are you still trying to recruit us into your little army fan club? Who on earth wants to spend their vacation looking at a bunch of sandy beaches and graveyards?" She tossed the tickets onto the table as if they were trash, the thick cardstock scattering beside the breadbasket. Then came the sound that shattered everything. My father let out a dry, rattling laugh. It wasn't a sound of amusement, it was a sound of contempt, cold and sharp. He leaned back in his leather chair, the movement slow and deliberate, and fixed his eyes on me. He raised his voice just enough for the couple at the adjacent table to stop their conversation and glance over. "Nobody here actually likes you, Katie," he said, each word a perfectly aimed shot. "You're an embarrassment in that uniform." The world went silent. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation. It all faded away into a deafening roar in my ears. Each word was a bullet, and they had all found their mark. I turned my head, a desperate, last-ditch appeal, toward my mother. I was searching for a flicker of defense, a denial, a hand on my arm, anything. But she offered nothing. Her eyes were locked on the plate in front of her. Her perfectly manicured hands, holding a steak knife and fork, were trembling slightly. She stared at her filet mignon as if it held the secrets to the universe, and then, with meticulous care, she made a cut. That small, precise action was her answer. It was the cruelest agreement of all. In the face of my public execution, she chose her steak. Something inside me broke. But it didn't shatter into a million pieces as it had so many times before. This time, it snapped clean. The hot, searing pain that had flooded my chest vanished, replaced by an astonishing, Arctic calm. The soldier took over. The daughter, the one who had been bleeding out on this battlefield for 35 years, was gone. I was no longer a participant in a family drama. I was an officer assessing a hostile situation. I methodically surveyed the faces at the table. Jessica's smug satisfaction, my father's cold superiority, my mother's cowardly retreat. I saw them not as family, but as enemy combatants. Information received, threat assessed. I looked my father directly in the eye, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. "Roger that," I said. My voice was even, clear, and completely devoid of emotion. It was the voice I used on the radio to acknowledge a direct order. Then I stood up. I placed my cloth napkin neatly on the table, turned, and walked away. I didn't look back. My footsteps were steady on the plush carpet, my back ramrod straight. I could feel their stunned silence behind me, a weapon that had finally lost its power. As I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped into the cool Boston night, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from Jessica. I glanced at the screen. "Good luck finding anyone else to admire your medals." I stopped on the sidewalk. The text wasn't an insult, it was targeting data. It was a confirmation of the enemy's position and disposition. It clarified my mission parameters. My lips curled into a true smile this time, cold and sharp. The battle was over. The war had just begun. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford that night. The flight back from Boston was a blur. Instead of succumbing to exhaustion, my mind was sharp, clear, operating with the cold precision of a mission planning session. The humiliation in the restaurant hadn't broken me, it had forged me into something new. By the time the sun began to cast a pale gray light over Virginia, my operational plan was complete. The first objective had to be symbolic. It had to be decisive. It had to hurt. At 0600 hours, I called my lawyer. He was an early riser, a fellow veteran. He answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and awake. "Sell the house in Richmond," I said, my voice devoid of any hesitation. There was no preamble, no explanation. It was an order. "Katie," he asked, a note of surprise in his voice, "the house your grandfather left you? Are you sure?" "Positive," I said. "Liquidate it as quickly as possible." That house wasn't just property. It was the ancestral home, the sacred ground my father always preached about, the physical manifestation of our family's legacy. To him, it was a status symbol, a cornerstone of his identity in the community. To me, it was the last chain tethering me to them. Selling it wasn't a financial decision. It was a strategic strike aimed directly at the heart of their pride. The news of the sale hit them like an artillery shell a week later. The incoming fire was immediate and chaotic. My father left a string of voicemails, his voice escalating from disbelief to pure, sputtering rage. "You ungrateful traitor!" he screamed in one message, his voice cracking. "You've destroyed this family's history." Jessica sent a barrage of texts filled with venom and profanity, which I read with detached curiosity before deleting them one by one. I listened to none of the voicemails in their entirety. I simply swiped them away. The noise was irrelevant. Then, one afternoon, my mother appeared on my doorstep. She looked smaller than I remembered, her eyes puffy and red-rimmed. She had driven 2 hours to stand here, a last-ditch effort at emotional warfare. "Katie, why would you do this?" she pleaded, her voice trembling. "We're your family." I looked at her, at the woman who had chosen her stake over her daughter, and I felt nothing. The well of emotion I'd once desperately drawn from for her was dry. "A family wouldn't have done what you did that night," I said, my voice calm and level. "You sat there. You were silent." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply stated a fact, an after-action report. Her face crumpled, not in understanding, but in the frustrated agony of someone whose usual tactics have suddenly failed. I gave a small final nod and gently closed the door. The clean, solid click of the lock felt like the end of an era. But even a soldier needs allies. The weight of the campaign I had just launched was beginning to settle on me, and I knew I couldn't wage this war alone. I called the one person I trusted without reservation, my fiancé, Mark. He was a captain in the JAG Corps, the Army's legal arm. His mind was as sharp as a bayonet, and his loyalty was absolute. We met at Gadsby's Tavern in Old Town Alexandria. The place was steeped in history, its dark wood walls and uneven floors having witnessed conversations with George Washington himself. It felt appropriate, a place of strategy and revolution. As we sat in a quiet corner booth, I laid out the entire situation for him, from the wedding invitation to the voicemails on my phone. Mark listened. He just listened, his eyes never leaving my face. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes or tell me it would all be okay. He let me deploy the entire ugly story without judgment. He treated my testimony with the respect a lawyer gives to a crucial witness. When I finally finished, the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was analytical. He took a slow sip of his beer. He wasn't just my fiancé in that moment. He was my strategic advisor. He saw the battlefield exactly as I did. "I understand," he said, his voice low and firm. "They crossed a line, a big one. It's time to fortify your defenses and prepare for a counteroffensive." This was the language I understood. This was the support I needed. Not pity, but a plan. Not sympathy, but solidarity. He reached across the table and refilled my glass from the pitcher of beer we were sharing. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "I remember you told me once you'd set up a family support fund," he said, his tone shifting from comforting to tactical. "From your savings and combat pay. You put Jessica in charge of managing it, right?" I nodded, a cold feeling beginning to creep up my spine. "Yeah, I set it up years ago, in case my parents needed anything as they got older. Jessica has her MBA, so it seemed logical." Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "Logical, maybe, but wise? Not so sure. Her lifestyle has been extravagant lately, even for a finance person." "My legal opinion?" He looked at me, his gaze sharp and focused. "It's time for a full financial reconnaissance mission into that fund. We need intelligence." The word hung in the air between us. Intelligence. It wasn't a suggestion born of anger or revenge. It wasn't a petty move. It was a sound, strategic military objective. Mark wasn't just offering a shoulder to cry on. He was offering me a weapon, crafted from his own expertise. For the first time since that horrible dinner in Boston, I didn't feel like I was just defending. With Mark by my side, I was about to go on the attack. Mark's financial reconnaissance mission was executed with the meticulous precision of a military operation. He didn't just look into it himself. He insisted on hiring an independent forensic accountant, a third-party expert, to ensure every finding was objective and legally irrefutable. "No room for error, no room for doubt," he'd said. "We need clean intelligence." A few weeks later, I was sitting in his home office late at night. The air was thick with tension, the only light coming from a single desk lamp that cast long shadows across the room. Stacks of bank statements, spreadsheets, and legal documents covered every available surface. It felt like a command center in the hours before a major offensive. Mark sat opposite me, his expression grim. He slid a highlighted document across the desk. "Here it is," he said, his voice low and even. The point of entry, it started small. A few $100s here and there. Then the withdrawals got bigger, bolder. The truth, laid out in the cold, hard language of numbers and dates, was far worse than anything I could have imagined. This wasn't a case of my sister borrowing some money and being too proud to ask. This wasn't a bad investment or a desperate gamble to keep a business afloat. This was systematic, calculated embezzlement. The forensic accountant's report was devastatingly clear. Over the past 4 years, a total of $500,000 had been siphoned from the fund. $500,000. Gone. My combat pay, my deployment bonuses, the money I had painstakingly saved with the simple, naive hope of one day providing a cushion for my parents in their old age. But where the money went was the deepest betrayal. It wasn't just one thing. Credit card statements, cross-referenced with the withdrawals, painted a nauseating picture of a life funded by my sacrifice. There were thousands spent on designer handbags from Chanel and Louis Vuitton. Tens of thousands on dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants in New York and D.C. Thousands more on spa weekends and luxury goods. Jessica hadn't just stolen my money. She had converted my sweat and blood into a lifestyle of shallow, glittering excess. Then Mark slid one final summary sheet in front of me. It detailed a single, massive expense, a 5-star, all-inclusive resort vacation to Bali for Jessica and 4 of her friends. The charge included first-class airfare, private villas, and a chartered yacht excursion. The total cost was just over $50,000. Mark pointed to the date of the transaction. "This trip took place last March," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. He didn't need to say another word. He knew my deployment schedule as well as I did. Last March, I wasn't sitting in a comfortable office. I was stationed at a forward operating base in Afghanistan, where the daily threat of rocket attacks was a constant reality. The image burned itself into my brain. Jessica, laughing on a yacht in the pristine blue waters of the Indian Ocean, paid for by the danger money I was earning while sleeping in full gear because the sirens could go off at any second. The sheer, sociopathic selfishness of it was breathtaking. I stared at the numbers on the page, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The shock was so profound, it bypassed emotion entirely and went straight to a place of ice-cold clarity. The hurt was there, a deep, tectonic ache. But on the surface, my mind was calm. The mission had changed. This was no longer about family drama. This was about a crime. The next morning, I acted. There was no debate, no second guessing. I picked up my phone and called my financial advisor, a man I trusted implicitly. "Good morning, Major," he said. "What can I do for you?" "I need you to execute an order for me," I said, my voice as steady as it would be giving a command on the battlefield. "Effective immediately." "Of course. Go ahead." "I want you to liquidate the entire remaining balance of the Ward Family Support Fund," I stated. "Every last cent." There was a brief pause on the other end. "The entire balance? Katie, that's nearly $1 million. Are you sure?" 100% sure, I confirmed. "And I have a destination for the funds. I want the full amount transferred as a one-time, unrestricted donation to the Tunnels to Towers Foundation." This time, the silence was longer. The Tunnels to Towers Foundation is an institution in the military and first responder community. They build mortgage-free homes for Gold Star families and catastrophically injured veterans. They are the embodiment of honor and sacrifice. My advisor, a Navy man himself, understood the significance immediately. "Roger that, Major," he said, his voice now filled with a newfound respect. "I'll execute the order immediately. Consider it done." I hung up the phone. I didn't send my family a text. I didn't make a single call to warn them or to explain. The action itself was the message. It was a perfect countermove, a checkmate they would never see coming. I was not only reclaiming what was mine, I was transforming their betrayal into a tribute to true heroes. I was taking the money Jessica had used to fund her shallow existence and turning it into a foundation of support for families who understood the true meaning of service. By donating to a military charity, I was using their own weapon, money, to make the most powerful statement possible. I was reaffirming my values, my identity, and my world in a way they could never dispute. They had considered my life's work, my honor, to be worthless. Now, the very fortune they coveted was being used to build a legacy based on that exact honor. The financial war was over, and I had won, not with anger, but with an act of weaponized grace. I knew the explosion would be heard all the way from Richmond. I just had to wait for the shockwave. I didn't have to wait long for the shockwave. The consequences of my family's actions began to unfold, not because of anything more I did, but because of the unshakable physics of cause and effect. I simply stood back and watched as the world they had built on arrogance and deceit began to crumble under its own weight. The first tremor was the lawsuit. Deprived of the financial river that had been flowing from my accounts, my father became unhinged. Fueled by wounded pride and sheer desperation, he filed a frivolous lawsuit against me. The claim was as absurd as it was insulting. He alleged that my grandfather's will was invalid, that I had exerted undue emotional influence on an old man to steal the family home. It was a pathetic, last-ditch attempt to regain control. The legal battle was a farce. At the preliminary hearing, which I did not attend, my lawyer simply presented the facts. He laid out the ironclad, notarized will and a sworn affidavit from my grandfather's estate planner confirming his clear and sound intentions. The judge, an experienced man who had seen his share of bitter family disputes, was not amused. According to the transcript Mark sent me, he dismissed the case in under 15 minutes. Then he did something that made me allow myself a small, grim smile. He ordered my father to pay all of my legal fees. The lawsuit, his grand weapon of intimidation, had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly, burying him deeper in debt and making the Ward family the subject of embarrassing gossip in the tight-knit Richmond community. Next, Jessica launched her offensive. With her financial world imploding, she turned to the only weapon she had left: public opinion. She began posting long, melodramatic screeds in Richmond community Facebook groups. She painted a tragic portrait of an aging, heartbroken couple whose cruel, unfeeling military daughter had stolen their ancestral home out from under them. She used words like honor and family, with a shamelessness that was almost impressive. But Mark had anticipated this exact maneuver. He had quietly and discreetly reached out to a few influential mutual family friends, people whose opinions mattered in their social circle. He didn't share the sordid details of the embezzlement. He simply provided them with a calm, emotionless, one-page summary, the facts of the dismissed lawsuit, and a brief note that a significant charitable donation had been made from a fund I had established. He didn't have to connect the dots. The truth began to spread, not like a wildfire, but like a slow, seeping tide. People started asking questions. Jessica's narrative, once so compelling, started to look thin. Instead of a flood of sympathy, she was met with a wall of skeptical silence. Her war of information had failed. The truth, it turned out, was a much more powerful weapon. The final devastating blow came from within her own world. The world of high finance has zero tolerance for scandal, not because of morality, but because it's bad for business. Someone at her firm, likely alerted by the public lawsuit and the whispers of financial trouble, had flagged her accounts for an internal review. An investigation was launched. Jessica was called into a conference room with her managing partner and a lawyer from HR. They didn't ask for her side of the story. In that world, the risk of a public relations nightmare far outweighed any loyalty to a single employee. They had the evidence of suspicious transactions, and that was all they needed. She was terminated, effective immediately. Her access to the building was revoked, her corporate accounts frozen. The career she had lorded over me for years, the one built on a foundation of Wall Street superiority, evaporated in a single, humiliating afternoon. The news of her firing spread like wildfire, merging with the story of the lawsuit to create a perfect storm of public disgrace. The Ward family name, once a symbol of suburban success, was now tarnished beyond repair. They hadn't been destroyed by me. They had been destroyed by their own choices. Pride, greed, and a lifetime of cruelty had finally presented them with a bill. And it was one they couldn't pay. I watched all of this from a distance, an observer, not a combatant. I felt no joy, no triumphant glee. I only felt a profound and quiet sense of finality. The war was over. The battlefield was quiet. It was during this strange, quiet aftermath that the letter arrived. It was a thick, formal envelope with the return address of a law firm I didn't recognize, my grandfather's old estate lawyers. My hands felt unsteady as I opened it. Inside wasn't a legal document, but another letter, smaller and older. The paper was yellowed with age, the envelope sealed with a wax stamp that had long since grown brittle. On the front, in my grandfather's familiar, strong, slanted handwriting, were the words, "For Catherine Ward, to be delivered only when she truly needs it." My breath caught in my throat. I ran my thumb over his handwriting, a jolt of memory and love so sharp it almost brought me to my knees. He was the only one. My first and only true ally. And here he was, reaching out from the past, a final piece of intelligence from my commanding officer. There's something incredibly powerful about getting a message from the past right when you need it most. If you believe some connections transcend time, please hit the like button and just comment, "I believe," to share that feeling. With trembling hands, I broke the brittle seal. A single, folded page lay inside. It was his voice, his wisdom, his final orders, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever it said would be the thing to guide me through the peace that was to come. I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, the old, yellowed envelope resting in my hands. It felt weightless and immensely heavy at the same time. The air around me seemed to still, charged with the gravity of this final message from the past. I could smell the faint, dry scent of old paper and time itself. The wax seal, bearing my grandfather's initial, W, was cracked and fragile. With a thumb that trembled ever so slightly, I broke it. The sound was a soft crackle, a whisper from a bygone era. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, folded once. I unfolded it carefully, my fingers tracing the strong, slanted handwriting of an old soldier. As I began to read, the world outside my apartment window, the traffic, the distant sirens, the hum of the city, all of it faded away. Time itself seemed to stop. "My dearest Katie," it began, "if you are reading this, it means life has tested you in a way I always feared it might. It likely means that the people you were supposed to count on have let you down. I am sorry for that. I saw the seeds of it in your father, even when he was a boy. He's a good man in many ways, but he is blinded by the world's definition of success. He doesn't see your strength, he only sees your difference. Do not ever make the mistake of seeing it that way yourself. Your difference, Katie, is your greatest strength." My breath hitched. He had seen it. All those years, all those lonely dinners and dismissed achievements, he had seen it all. He hadn't just been a quiet old man in the corner, he had been an observer, a silent witness to my private war. He went on to write about his own time in the war, not about the battles, but about the quiet moments in between. He wrote about the unshakable bond between soldiers, a loyalty forged in fire that civilians could never truly understand. He wrote about honor, not as something you display for parades, but as what you do when no one is watching, when the only person you have to answer to is the one in the mirror. "I remember taking you fishing on the James River when you were just a little girl," the letter continued. "And a wave of memory so sharp and sweet washed over me that it almost took my breath away. I could almost feel the humid Virginia air, the gentle rocking of the small boat. You got your line tangled in a submerged log, and you were trying so hard to pull it free, your face all scrunched up with determination. You were ready to fight that log all day. I told you then what I will tell you now. Life is like fishing, kiddo. Sometimes you have to cut the line to save the boat. Some things and some people are not worth sinking over. You have to know when to let go." The words resonated in the quiet room, a perfect, crystalline truth. He was giving me permission. Permission to cut the line. Permission to save my boat. But it was the final paragraph that finally broke through the wall of composure I had spent a lifetime building. "They will likely never understand you, Katie. And that's okay. You do not need their permission to be great. Honor is not something that is given to you by others. It is something you build within yourself every single day with every choice you make. This house I left you is not just bricks and mortar. It is your freedom. It is a foundation. Use it to build a life of your own making, on your own terms. Never ever let anyone extinguish that fire inside you." A single, hot tear fell from my eye and landed on the page, blurring the ink of his final words. And then another followed, and another. For the first time in years, Major Katie Ward wept. But these were not the tears of grief or pain that I had swallowed for so long. They were tears of pure, absolute release. It was the feeling of a soldier, lost behind enemy lines for years, finally hearing a friendly voice on the radio. It was the feeling of coming home. The crushing weight I had carried on my shoulders for my entire life, the desperate, exhausting need for my father's approval, for my family's acceptance, it simply lifted. It dissolved into nothingness, washed away by the words of a man who had seen me, truly seen me, all along. The letter was a new compass. It reoriented my entire world. I realized my struggle was no longer about them. That war was over. The ceasefire had been called. My new mission was not to fight against my family, but to fight for something far more important, for my own future, and for his legacy. The validation I had so desperately craved from a father who couldn't give it had been there all along, a priceless inheritance from a man who had been a truer father to my spirit than my own had ever been. I folded the letter with reverence, holding it to my chest. A profound peace settled over me, a quiet strength that felt more real and permanent than any medal I'd ever earned. the battlefield had shifted. It was no longer about tearing down the old world that had hurt me. It was about building a new one. And I knew exactly what my first step had to be. My grandfather's letter had ended the war, but I soon realized that winning a war and healing from it are two entirely different missions. The external enemies had been neutralized, but an internal insurgency remained. The ghosts of their words, the years of feeling invisible, had left behind invisible scars, deeper than I cared to admit. The silence in my life, once a source of peace, now felt vast and empty. It was Mark who suggested it. "You've secured the perimeter," he said one evening, his voice gentle but firm. "Now it's time to clear the internal threats." He recommended a support group he knew of, a therapy circle for female veterans at a local VA center. My first instinct was to refuse. I was an officer, a commander. My entire career was built on projecting strength, on being the one with the answers, not the one with the problems. Sharing weaknesses in a circle of strangers felt like a surrender. But then I remembered a book I'd been reading by the researcher Brené Brown, Daring Greatly. She wrote that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but our most accurate measure of courage. Walking into that room felt more daunting than walking into a combat zone. I went. I sat with my back straight, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, observing the other women with a commander's detached assessment. There was a former Air Force pilot, a Marine Corps logistics chief, a Navy nurse. We were all so different, yet I could see the same guardedness in their eyes that I felt in my own. For the first 2 sessions, I said nothing. I just listened. Then, in the third week, a young Marine, barely 25, began to speak. She talked about returning from her deployment with severe PTSD and how her family told her to just get over it, because she was making everyone uncomfortable. She spoke of the loneliness, of feeling like a ghost in her own home. As she talked, something inside me cracked. A single tear traced a path down my cheek, then another. Soon, I was crying silently, the kind of deep, shuddering sobs I hadn't allowed myself since I was a child. For the first time, in a sterile room in a government building, surrounded by strangers, I felt completely and utterly understood. That was the beginning of my true healing. While I was rebuilding my emotional defenses, Mark was helping me rebuild my financial ones. We sat down with a new financial planner and piece by piece constructed a fortress. We established irrevocable trusts, diversified my investments, and created a detailed estate plan. It wasn't about the money. It was a symbolic act of taking absolute control of my future. Every document I signed was another brick in the wall protecting my peace, a guarantee that no one from my old life could ever touch my new one again. The healing came in waves. Some days were clear and bright, others were clouded with the old, familiar ache of what I had lost, of the family I wished I'd had. But through it all, Mark was my constant, my rock, my teammate. One crisp afternoon in late autumn, he drove me out to Shenandoah National Park. We hiked a trail off the Skyline Drive, the air cool and smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. The mountains were on fire with color, fiery reds, brilliant oranges, and blazing yellows. It was beautiful, peaceful. It was everything my life had not been. As the sun began to dip below the ridgeline, painting the sky in stunning shades of orange and purple, Mark stopped at an overlook. He didn't fumble for words or launch into a grand romantic speech. He just turned to me, took both of my hands in his, and looked me straight in the eye. "Katie," he said, his voice quiet and steady. "I've watched you fight enemies overseas, and I've watched you fight enemies at home. I have never, in my entire life, met anyone with more strength or more honor than you. I want to be your teammate for the rest of my life." Then, right there on the rocky overlook, with the breathtaking beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains as his witness, he got down on one knee. I looked at this man, this incredible, loyal man who had stood by me not as a savior, but as an equal, an ally. He wasn't offering to fix me or rescue me. He was offering to stand with me, to have my back, for all the missions to come. A real, genuine smile spread across my face, and the tears that came to my eyes this time were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. I nodded, unable to speak, and he slid a simple, elegant ring onto my finger. It was a promise of a future built not on obligation or blood, but on the bedrock of mutual respect. The news of our engagement spread quickly through our chosen family. My phone, which had once been a source of incoming attacks, now became a vessel of joy. Congratulatory texts poured in from friends and colleagues. My old commanding general sent a case of vintage champagne with a handwritten note. The women from my therapy group threw us a small, impromptu party with a homemade cake and cheap sparkling wine, and it felt more celebratory than the most extravagant gala. The outpouring of genuine happiness from this circle of people, my new unit, my real family, was a stark and beautiful contrast to the cold silence from Richmond. I realized then that I hadn't lost a family. I had escaped a toxic environment and, in doing so, had made room in my life for a real one. A family forged not by accident of birth, but by deliberate choice. A unit bound together by loyalty, respect, and unconditional love. In the months that followed, news of my former family reached me in fragmented pieces like distant, garbled radio transmissions from a war I was no longer fighting. I didn't seek out the information. It simply found its way to me through the quiet grapevine of mutual acquaintances. I learned that my parents, crushed by legal fees and mounting debt, had been forced to sell the house they'd lived in for 40 years. The grand suburban home that had been the stage for so much of my pain was gone, replaced by a small, sterile condo in a retirement community. The thought brought me no pleasure, only a quiet, hollow echo of what could have been. I learned about Jessica, too. Facing fraud charges from her former employer, she'd accepted a plea bargain to avoid prison time. But a felony conviction and a permanent mark on her financial record meant her high-flying career was over for good. She who had defined her worth by her title and her salary now had neither. I listened to these reports with a strange sense of detachment. There was no victory lap, no triumphant fist pump. They didn't collapse because of me. They collapsed under the weight of their own choices, their own greed, their own cruelty. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed gravity to do its work. Then one evening, a call came from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but some instinct told me to. It was my mother. Her voice was different this time. The anger was gone, the blame was gone. All that remained was a thin, brittle desperation. "Katie," she began, her voice cracking. "Your father, his heart condition is getting worse. And Jessica she's a mess. You can't just turn your back on us like this. We're your family." I stood in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, and I listened. I listened to the tremor in her voice, to the unspoken plea for a rescue, for a return to the old order where I was the designated shock absorber for their lives. The old Katie would have felt a surge of guilt, of obligation. The old Katie would have caved. But the old Katie was gone. I felt no anger, only a vast, distant sadness for these people I no longer knew how to love. "I'm sorry to hear about Dad's health," I said, and my voice was calm, steady. It was the voice of a compassionate but firm professional. "I can send you the information for a highly rated in-home care service, but I can't come back. I wish you all the best, Mom." Then, before she could reply, before the familiar guilt could find a crack in my armor, I ended the call. I set the phone down on the counter and took a deep, steadying breath. The final boundary had been drawn. The line had been cut. The contrast between their world and mine was never starker than on my wedding day. Mark and I were married at the Marine Corps Memorial Chapel in Quantico, Virginia. It wasn't a lavish affair. The chapel itself, with its soaring wooden arches and stained glass windows depicting scenes of courage and sacrifice, was all the decoration we needed. The pews weren't filled with distant relatives and my parents' business associates. They were filled with our comrades, our friends, the women from my therapy group, the people who had stood with us in the trenches of our lives. They were our family. There was no one from the Ward family in attendance. No father to walk me down the aisle, no mother to fuss over my dress, no sister to stand beside me. And as I stood at the altar, holding Mark's hand, I looked out at the faces of the people who truly saw me, who celebrated me, and I felt not a single pang of absence. On the contrary, I felt an overwhelming sense of presence. I felt completely, utterly whole. The space wasn't empty, it was filled with genuine love. Later, in the car on the way to the small, joyful reception we were having at a local tavern, Mark squeezed my hand. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes full of a gentle understanding. I looked out the window at the green Virginia landscape, at the new spring leaves unfurling on the trees. A sense of profound peace washed over me, a quiet stillness I had never known before. "I'm okay," I said, and I meant it more than anything I had ever said in my life. "I'm more than okay." I turned to him, a smile finding its way to my lips. "I realized something today. I've forgiven them." Mark looked at me, a question in his eyes. "It's not for them," I explained. "It's not about accepting what they did or pretending it didn't happen. It's about accepting that they are who they are, and they will never, ever change. It's about letting go of the burden of hoping they will." I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs feeling cleaner, lighter. My forgiveness wasn't a gift for them, it was a gift for me, the gift of freedom. The war was over, the battles were done, and for the first time, I wasn't just a soldier. I was a survivor, standing in the quiet dawn of a new and peaceful life. A year after our wedding, I stood in a university auditorium, the lights warm on my face. The room was filled with the low, expectant murmur of students and faculty. I wasn't wearing my dress blues. I was in a simple civilian blazer. I wasn't there as Lieutenant Colonel Ward. I was there as the founder of the William Ward Honor Scholarship Fund. Using the proceeds from the sale of my grandfather's house and a significant portion of my own assets, I had created a foundation, a nonprofit with a singular mission: to provide scholarships for young women pursuing careers in the military or public service. I had taken the foundation my grandfather gave me, his house, his freedom, and used it to build a new one. I had transformed a symbol of my pain into a source of someone else's hope. On the stage, the inaugural recipient of the scholarship was finishing her speech. She was a young ROTC cadet, her eyes bright with the kind of fierce, unblinking fire I recognized so well. She spoke with passion about her dream of serving her country, and she thanked the fund for giving her the financial freedom to pursue that dream without compromise. As I listened to her, I didn't just see a promising young cadet. I saw a ghost of myself at that age, a determined girl desperate to prove her worth, to find her place in a world that didn't quite understand her. I saw the same steadiness my grandfather had seen in me. But there was a difference. This young woman wouldn't have to walk that path alone. She would have a network of support, a foundation beneath her feet that I never did. And in that moment, I understood what true legacy meant. It wasn't the name on a deed or the history contained within the walls of a house. It was this. It was passing the torch. This was my grandfather's legacy, and it was now mine. My life today is full. It's a quiet, sturdy fullness built on a foundation of peace I fought hard to win. I have a career that challenges and fulfills me. I have Mark, a husband who is not just a partner, but a true teammate in every sense of the word. And I have a purpose that extends far beyond my own happiness. Every so often, a thought of my old family will drift into my mind. It's no longer a jolt of anger or a wave of pain. It's more like a distant, detached empathy, the kind you might feel for characters in a novel you read long ago. I see them as people trapped in a small gilded cage of their own making, obsessed with status and appearances, while my world has grown infinitely larger, richer, and more meaningful. I no longer need their approval because I have finally found it where it always should have been, within myself, and in the tangible good I can put out into the world. My worth is not reflected in their eyes, but in the bright, hopeful eyes of the young women my foundation supports. The ceremony concluded. I walked onto the stage to congratulate the young cadet. I handed her the oversized ceremonial check, and we posed for a picture, both of us smiling. But after the flash faded, I held onto her handshake for a moment longer. I looked her directly in the eye, wanting her to feel the weight and sincerity of my next words. I wasn't going to give her a canned speech or a hollow platitude. I was going to give her the most valuable piece of intelligence I had ever received. The words my grandfather had given me. Never, ever let anyone extinguish that fire inside you, I said, my voice quiet but firm. A flicker of recognition, of understanding, passed across her face. She nodded, her grip tightening on mine. Yes, ma'am, she said. I won't. As our hands parted, I stepped back. In that moment, I saw it all clearly. 3 generations of warriors connected by a simple, powerful idea. My grandfather, the soldier from the greatest generation, me, the officer who had to fight a war at home, and this young woman, the future. This story, my story, was never truly about the end of a family. It was about the definition of one. It wasn't about the pain they caused, but about what I chose to build from that pain. It wasn't the end of a battle. It was the beginning of countless lives that would be touched, countless futures that would be forged, all because a soldier, long ago, chose to fight for her own honor, and in doing so, discovered how to build a legacy that would truly last. And that is where my story finds its peace. Not in victory over others, but in the purpose I built for myself. This journey taught me a vital lesson. Our true legacy isn't defined by the family we were born into, but by the one we choose to build and the honor we create every single day. If this story resonated with you and you want to be part of a community that believes in the power of turning pain into purpose, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more journeys of strength and resilience to light. And remember, your story is yours to write. Protect that fire.